What would you do if the woman who raised you, the one who tucked you in at night and called you her son, turned out to be the very person responsible for your mother's death? This isn't just a story about betrayal, it's about how trust can be built on lies so convincing, so well performed that even the most careful person wouldn't see through them. It's about how grief can be manipulated and how silence can bury truth for years until something cracks it open. We don't often talk about what happens behind closed doors in blended families. Most people want to believe that love is enough to bind strangers together under one roof. And sometimes it is, but what happens when one of those strangers has an agenda? When the past hasn't just been buried, it's been covered up? Today's story is about Ethan, a boy who lost his mother in what everyone believed was a tragic car accident. He was only 9. A year later, his father remarried, and Carla stepped into the role of his stepmother. She cooked his favorite meals. She helped him with math homework. She called him my boy, but 15 years later, Ethan found a letter that made his entire childhood collapse. It was written by his birth mother before she died, and it exposed a secret so dark, so deeply buried, that it would change everything Ethan thought he knew about love, family, and truth. Ethan grew up in a quiet suburb just outside Portland, Oregon. His early childhood was filled with simple memories: bike rides in the summer, pancakes on Saturdays, bedtime stories read by his mom, Laura. She was warm, gentle, and had this calm way of making Ethan feel safe no matter what was going on in the world. But everything changed when Laura died. The accident happened on a rainy morning. Ethan remembered waking up to flashing red lights and his dad's trembling voice. He was too young to understand what had really happened, but old enough to feel the silence that took over the house after her death. There were no more pancakes. No more bedtime stories, just a father doing his best to survive grief, and a boy who didn't know how to ask for comfort. About a year later, Michael, Ethan's father, met Carla. She worked at a local bank and was, on the surface, everything Laura wasn't: outgoing, practical, confident. When she started spending more time at the house, Ethan didn't know how to feel. She wasn't his mom, but she smiled at him in the morning. She brought him snacks and asked about his day at school. Eventually, she moved in. Then came the wedding, and just like that, Carla became mom. To Ethan's young mind, it was a confusing mix of comfort and guilt. He didn't want to forget Laura, but Carla made it so easy to feel normal again. She said things like, "We're a team now, and your mom would want you to be happy." And for the most part, Ethan believed her. Years passed, and life settled. Carla attended parent-teacher meetings. She clapped the loudest at his school plays. She made his favorite meal, mac and cheese with crushed chips on top, every Friday night. By the time Ethan reached high school, he didn't think much about the woman who came before. Carla had been there for most of his life. She had filled the empty space with stability and structure. She wasn't perfect, but she showed up. At least, that's what Ethan thought. Until he found the letter "it" wasn't a sudden shift. The signs were quiet, subtle, like background noise you don't notice until the room goes completely still. "N" middle school. Ethan started to pick up on small moments that didn't feel quite right. Carla was still present, still doing everything a parent should. But sometimes, when his dad was out of the house, her tone would change. Not cruel, just cold, detached, as if the kindness was no longer necessary once the audience was gone. There were the little digs, comments that felt too sharp to be innocent. "You're just like your mother, so dramatic." Or, "If Laura had been better with money, maybe things would have been different." Ethan wasn't sure how to respond. He barely remembered his mom, so he had no way to defend her. He assumed Carla was just venting, maybe trying to make sense of the past in her own way. So he let it go. But the moments piled up. When Ethan turned 13, he asked Carla if they could visit his mother's grave. Her response was a clipped, "Why dwell on the dead when you've got a life to live?" It stung. Not because she said no, but because of how she said it. Like his grief was an inconvenience. One afternoon, while rummaging through an old box in the garage, looking for his soccer cleats, Ethan came across a small velvet pouch. Inside was a silver locket. When he opened it, he saw 2 photos, one of himself as a baby, and one of a woman he only vaguely remembered but somehow knew was his mom. He showed the locket to Carla, hopeful for a story, a memory, anything. "Oh, that," she said too quickly. "Must have come from a garage sale. Probably fake." Then she took it from his hands and slipped it into her coat pocket. Ethan never saw it again. As he got older, Ethan learned to avoid certain topics. His mom, her accident, even the early days of Carla and Michael's relationship. Every time he brought them up, the mood would shift and Carla would find a way to change the subject. Sometimes she'd fake a headache. Other times she'd sigh and say, "We've moved on, haven't we?" The truth was, Carla had created a world where Ethan's past didn't quite belong, where remembering his mom too often felt like betrayal. where asking questions made him feel guilty. And so, like many children who don't yet have the words to explain what they're feeling, Ethan stayed silent. Until the silence broke itself. Ethan was 25 when everything unraveled. It started on a weekend visit to his childhood home. His father had recently retired and asked for help cleaning out the attic. 2 decades of forgotten boxes, dusty furniture, and water-stained photo albums. They spent most of the day sorting through old sports gear, baby clothes, and stacks of magazines no one remembered saving. In the far corner, underneath a tarp, was a small wooden chest. It was older than the rest, with a broken latch and faded initials carved into the lid, L.M. Laura Mitchell. His mother. Your mom's things, Michael said softly. I hadn't touched them since then. Ethan opened the chest carefully. Inside were pieces of his childhood he hadn't seen in years, a storybook with his name scribbled in crayon, a worn teddy bear, and a bundle of envelopes tied together with string. One envelope stood out. It was newer, not yellowed with time like the others. It was sealed, and on the front, in handwriting that made his chest tighten, were the words, "To Ethan for when you're ready." His hands trembled as he opened it. The letter was dated just 3 weeks before his mother's death. In it, Laura wrote about feeling watched, about how someone had been calling her at night and hanging up, how her car alarm had gone off several times in the middle of the night, even when it was locked. She mentioned someone showing up at her workplace, someone she had once trusted. And then came the name Carla. Laura didn't accuse her outright, but the implication was clear. She wrote, "If something happens to me, I need you to know I was afraid, not of an accident, but of being silenced." Ethan read the letter 3 times. By the 4th, he was no longer reading, he was just staring at the page, trying to make sense of what it meant. Carla? The woman who raised him? Who kissed his scraped knees, sat through his school concerts, and told him she loved him? Had she been lying the whole time? He didn't say anything to his father. Not yet. He folded the letter, slid it into his backpack, and spent the rest of the weekend in a fog. Back at his apartment, Ethan couldn't sleep. The words kept echoing in his mind. If something happens to me, being silenced, Carla. It didn't matter that the letter wasn't proof in a legal sense. For Ethan, it was enough to shatter everything he thought he knew. It wasn't just suspicion now. It was personal, real. And suddenly the memories, Carla's coldness, the missing locket, the way she flinched whenever Laura's name was mentioned, took on new, disturbing meaning. This wasn't about grief anymore. It was about truth. In the days that followed, Ethan became consumed. The letter hadn't just opened an emotional wound, it had raised questions that refused to let him rest. He couldn't stop thinking about his mother's death, about the details that had always seemed too neatly explained. It was time to find out what had really happened. He started where anyone might. The accident report. After a few phone calls and some paperwork, Ethan got a copy of the official police file from the night his mother died. The summary was brief: single vehicle collision, wet roads, likely hydroplaning. No signs of foul play. Case closed. But something in the file caught his attention, a small detail most people would miss. A witness had been listed. Carla Simmons. He read it again. Carla had been at the scene. No one had ever mentioned that before. Not his father. Not Carla. She'd never said a word about being there the morning Laura died. That discovery set off a cascade of doubt. Ethan spent the next few weeks tracking down anything he could: old neighbors, co-workers of his mother's, even Laura's former manager at the local bookstore where she had worked. Most didn't remember much, just that Laura was kind, quiet, kept to herself. But one woman, a retired librarian named Denise, paused when he mentioned Carla. I remember a few things, she said. Your mom once told me she was worried that someone had been following her. I assumed it was an ex-boyfriend or something. She never gave me a name, but she looked scared. Ethan asked if she remembered when that conversation happened. Right before she died, Denise replied. A week or 2, tops. Another piece clicked into place. He kept digging. Through an old family friend, Ethan got in touch with a mechanic who had worked on his mom's car shortly before the crash. The man didn't remember much. It had been over a decade, but agreed to check his old logs. A few days later, he called back. Your mom brought the car in for brake problems, he said. But we didn't find anything unusual. What's odd is someone came back the next day asking questions about it. A woman. She said she was a friend of the family, tall, dark hair. I remember thinking she didn't seem too concerned about the car, more like she was checking up on what we knew. Ethan didn't need a name. He already knew who it was. His stomach turned. Each new clue didn't just confirm his suspicions, they painted a picture. A picture of someone carefully erasing their tracks, managing perceptions, and staying just close enough to watch the damage unfold. Ethan didn't have hard evidence. Nothing that would hold up in court. But emotionally, mentally, spiritually, he knew Carla had been involved. Maybe not directly. Maybe she hadn't touched the brakes or caused the crash herself. But she was there. She had a motive. And she had buried the truth for 15 years, all while pretending to love him. It was time to stop pretending. Ethan didn't confront Carla right away. He wasn't ready. Part of him still hoped there was a misunderstanding, that maybe his mother's fears had been unfounded, that Carla had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. But deep down, he already knew the truth. And truth has a way of demanding to be seen. He decided to orchestrate the confrontation on his own terms. Ethan planned a small family gathering under the pretense of celebrating his father's retirement. Carla was, of course, invited. She showed up wearing her usual warm smile, bringing a homemade apple pie and greeting Ethan with a kiss on the cheek like nothing had changed. He could hardly look at her. After dinner, Ethan stood up and thanked everyone for coming. Then he said there was something he wanted to share, something important, something personal. He dimmed the lights, turned on the projector he'd set up earlier, and displayed a scanned copy of his mother's letter on the screen. The room went quiet. No one said a word as Ethan read the letter aloud, his voice steady but cold. When he finished, he turned to Carla. "Do you remember writing this, Mom?" he asked, emphasizing the last word in a way that no longer sounded affectionate. Carla's face went pale. Her mouth opened, then closed. She looked at Michael, who stared at her in disbelief. "Is this some kind of joke?" he asked, his voice shaking. Ethan stepped forward. "She was afraid of someone, Dad. She named Carla, and Carla never told us she was there the morning Mom died." The silence in the room was suffocating. Carla finally spoke. "It's not what you think," she whispered. "Then tell us what it is," Ethan said. But she didn't. She just stood there, trembling, looking smaller than he had ever seen her. Ethan continued, his voice calm but cutting. "You let me grow up thinking you were my savior, my second chance. But the whole time you were hiding the one thing I deserved to know." Carla started to cry. She tried to step toward him, but he backed away. Michael looked devastated. He couldn't even speak. "I'm not here for revenge," Ethan said. "I'm here for the truth. And now that it's out, I don't need anything from you anymore." Carla left quietly that night. She didn't defend herself. She didn't deny anything. And in some ways, that silence confirmed everything Ethan had feared. He didn't feel triumphant. There was no satisfaction in her shame. But there was peace, a quiet, painful peace that came from finally, after all those years, knowing what had really happened. The house felt different after that night, emptier, heavier. Carla moved out within the week. She left behind no notes, no explanations, just silence. Her absence echoed through every corner of the house, not because she was missed, but because her presence had always been louder than anyone realized. Michael tried to make sense of it all. He'd spent 15 years building a life with a woman he thought he knew. Now, that life felt like a mirage, something real, only until you got too close. Asked Ethan more than once if he was sure. If the letter was enough, if he had proof. But Ethan didn't need more. His certainty wasn't rooted in evidence, it was anchored in instinct, in the weight of years of subtle wrongness that now made sense. He didn't hate Carla. That was what surprised him most. He pitied her. Somewhere in her life, something had broken, and instead of healing, she buried her cracks inside someone else's family. Ethan started going to therapy. Not to erase the past, but to understand how it had shaped him, how it had made him doubt his memories, his instincts, his sense of safety. Some nights he dreamed of his mother, not in flashes of fear or sorrow, but in moments of quiet, her voice reading him to sleep, her fingers tucking the blanket under his chin. And in those dreams, for the first time in years, he felt like a son again. Time didn't heal everything, but it gave Ethan enough space to rebuild. In the months that followed, he moved out of his father's house and into a small apartment near the city. It wasn't much, just a second-floor walk-up with creaky floors and sunlight that poured through the windows in the late afternoon, but it was his, a space untouched by lies. Ethan didn't share the full story with many people. He didn't post about it online or bring it up at parties. But in quieter moments, when someone mentioned losing a parent or asked how he managed to stay grounded, he would tell pieces of it, not for shock, not for sympathy, just because it was part of who he was. He found purpose in helping others, especially young people trying to navigate their own grief, confusion, or blended families. He started volunteering at a local youth center. Eventually, he became a part-time counselor. He didn't present himself as someone with answers, just someone who had lived through silence and come out the other side, still searching, still learning, still open. Sometimes A teenager would look at him and ask, "How did you forgive her?" And he'd reply, gently, "I didn't. I just stopped needing to." Ethan didn't need Carla's apology. He didn't need her to admit what she did or explain why. The truth had found him. That was enough. What mattered now was what he did with it. So he told his story. Carefully, honestly, and in doing so, he created space for others to tell theirs too. Families are complicated. They're not always built on blood, and they're certainly not always built on truth. Sometimes the people who raise us aren't who we thought. And sometimes love gets tangled up in secrecy, guilt, and survival. Ethan's story isn't just about a stepmother or a hidden past. It's about the quiet strength it takes to face what hurts and the courage it takes to ask the questions no one wants answered. Maybe you've been in a situation like this where something didn't feel right, but you couldn't put your finger on it. Maybe you've carried doubts or silence or grief that no one else sees. You're not alone. And if this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect. What truths are still waiting to be uncovered in your life? What conversations have you been avoiding? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you've ever faced a hidden truth or struggled with trust in your family, share your story. Someone out there might need to hear it. And if you found this video meaningful, please share, and subscribe. We tell stories that speak to the heart, and you help us reach the people who need them most.
Imagine being at your lowest point in life, fighting for your survival, and discovering that the people you trusted the most walked away. This is exactly what happened to me. My name is Isabel, and 4 years ago my world shattered in a doctor's office. I was 46, happily married, or so I thought, to David for over 20 years. We had a son, Max, who had just turned 18. Everything seemed perfect, but when I found a lump during a routine self-exam, I brushed it off as nothing. But deep down, something told me to get it checked. When the doctor confirmed it, everything changed. Stage 2 breast cancer. I didn't expect the words, and I definitely didn't expect what would come next. That evening, I sat David and Max down and told them. I thought we'd face this together, but what followed shattered my heart. This is the story of how they abandoned me, and how I rose from the ashes to claim my own strength back. It started like any other day, until the moment I found a lump. At first, I told myself it was nothing to worry about. I had been healthy, active, and had no reason to fear cancer. But something inside me kept nagging. I went to the doctor, and when he felt it, his face immediately changed. I knew then that my life was about to change forever. He said the words no one ever wants to hear. Stage 2 breast cancer. Those words stuck with me as I tried to process the overwhelming news. I remember sitting with David and Max that night, telling them about the diagnosis, the trembling in my voice, the silence that filled the room, and the way Max kept staring at the floor without saying a word. David, though, he put a hand on my shoulder and said, "We'll get through this together." At the time, his words sounded comforting, even though deep down, I had a gut feeling they were just words. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of doctor's visits, tests, and decisions. My oncologist told me the plan: surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation. It would be brutal, but I was ready to fight. The first few days, David drove me to all my appointments. Max, though, kept to himself. He barely spoke, always with his headphones in. I thought it was just shock, maybe even fear, but I told myself to be patient and give them time. I was broken. There's no sugarcoating it. The betrayal from David and Max was more painful than any physical pain I was enduring. But somehow, in that moment of silence, a spark ignited within me. I wasn't going to let cancer take me, and I wasn't going to let the people who abandoned me define who I was. As I faced the darkest days of my illness, something incredible began to happen. People I barely knew began to show up in my life. Mrs. Carter from next door would leave hot soup on my doorstep every other night. Alicia, a friend I hadn't seen in years, heard about my diagnosis and showed up with groceries and movies to keep me entertained. A local church group even offered to take me to my medical appointments when I couldn't drive myself. They weren't family, they weren't even close friends, but they were there. They were the ones who showed up when the people I loved the most walked away. That was when I realized something powerful. I wasn't truly alone. One afternoon, I received a call from the cancer center. They had assigned me a volunteer caregiver named Eleanor. She was in her 60s, brisk but kind, and she reminded me of my late mother. She wasn't there to feel sorry for me. She was there to help me fight. She drove me to every appointment, pushed me when I was too weak to go on, and never let me forget that I was still capable of fighting. Slowly but surely, I began to heal, emotionally and physically. But even as my body started to respond to treatment, the emotional wounds still lingered. I'd look through old family photos, seeing Max's graduation pictures, David's proud smile, and I'd wonder, were we ever really a family? Or had I just been the glue holding everything together? But then things started to change, and not in the way I had hoped. 2 months into my treatment, David became more distant. He would sit on the opposite side of the room, his face glued to his phone. He stopped asking how I felt or offering any physical affection. I could feel it. The wall between us was growing higher, brick by brick. One night I overheard him talking on the phone in the guest room. His voice was soft, like he didn't want me to hear, but I did. "It's just so hard, you know? She's not the same anymore. I didn't sign up for this," he said. I was crushed. I couldn't sleep that night, not because of the nausea or the pain from my chemotherapy, but because of those words. I thought to myself, how could he say that? The next morning I confronted him. His face went pale when I asked him what he meant. He didn't deny it. "I can't do this anymore, Isabel. This isn't a life," he said. I was speechless. He had spent 20 years with me, and now in the midst of my battle for life, he was telling me that he couldn't handle it anymore. I didn't know what to say. But then, 2 days later, he packed a bag. Max followed him without a word. No goodbye, just the sound of Max dragging his suitcase down the hall. I sat there, in the hospital bed, alone, with chemotherapy still running through my veins. That was the moment I realized I was truly alone. My husband, my son, both of them had walked away. No one was there to comfort me or hold my hand through this nightmare. I was left to fight not just cancer, but abandonment as well. 4 years passed and I had managed to rebuild my life, piece by piece. Slowly but surely I was healing. My hair had grown back, soft and silver, and I was in remission. I had regained my strength, and while there were still scars, both physical and emotional, I was stronger than ever. My life had taken a new direction, but then came the call that would change everything. One day I received a letter from a lawyer and I couldn't believe what I was reading. My great-uncle Harold, who I hadn't seen in years, had passed away. He was a reclusive man living in a small beach town, and we hadn't spoken in over a decade. But, as it turned out, he had left everything to me, his property, stocks, investments, and even an offshore account. After taxes and fees, the total came to a staggering $8 million. The news was a shock to my system. I sat there in stunned silence, unable to comprehend the magnitude of it all. $8 million, more money than I could ever have imagined, and all of it was now mine. But what I hadn't considered at that moment was how this newfound wealth would affect those around me, especially the ones who had walked away when I needed them the most. David and Max didn't know about the inheritance at first, but I knew they would find out soon enough. And I knew, deep down, that they would come back. They had walked away when I was at my lowest, but now that I was thriving again and had something they could use, I was sure they'd be back, seeking to regain what they thought they had lost. What they didn't realize was that I wasn't the same woman they had left behind. I had fought for my life, rebuilt my strength, and found new meaning in life. The woman they had abandoned was long gone, and when they came back, they would face the consequences of their actions. I was no longer the woman they could walk all over. It wasn't long before I heard the knock on my door. It wasn't the usual polite kind that you'd expect from a neighbor or delivery driver. No, this was loud, insistent, and almost demanding, like whoever was on the other side thought they had every right to be let in. I froze for a moment, standing in the middle of my living room with a coffee mug in my hand. My heart pounded in my chest as I walked toward the door, my mind racing. As I peered through the peephole, there they were, David and Max. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I thought I might be hallucinating, but no, there they were, standing on my doorstep as if nothing had happened. David looked older, more tired. His perfectly groomed beard was patchy, his clothes wrinkled, and he looked different. Max, now in his early 20s, stood awkwardly behind him. He had grown taller, leaner, but there was still something in his eyes, a look that hadn't changed. The same discomfort, the same reluctance to face the consequences of his actions. I didn't open the door right away. I just stood there, watching them from behind the door, my mind whirling. Why now? Why, after 4 years of silence, after all that had happened, were they suddenly back? Then it hit me. The inheritance. It had to be the money. They had heard about my great-uncle's estate, and now, suddenly, they wanted back in. After a few moments, David knocked again, more firmly this time. "Isabel," he called out. "We just want to talk." I took a deep breath, my hand gripping the coffee mug tightly. I didn't rush to open the door. Instead, I let them wait. When I finally did, I opened it just a crack, enough to see them both standing there. David's face lit up, a look of relief washing over him. Max offered a half-hearted smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm surprised you're here," I said, my voice steady, controlled. "I figured you were still too busy living your best life without me." David's smile faltered, and for the first time I saw a flash of discomfort in his eyes. Max shifted his weight from one foot to the other, but he didn't say anything. "Can we come in?" David asked, his tone almost pleading. "No," I replied firmly. "You can talk from here." There was an uncomfortable silence that stretched between us. I could see them both glance at each other, unsure of how to proceed. Finally, David cleared his throat and tried again. "I heard about Harold's estate," he said, his voice softer now. "And, well, we were hoping maybe we could reconnect. Start fresh, you know?" I let out a quiet laugh, my heart pounding in my chest. "Reconnect?" I repeated, incredulously. "After 4 years of nothing? Now that I have something you want to reconnect?" David shifted uneasily, his expression hardening. "It's not just about the money, Isabel," he insisted, but his words were hollow, and I could tell he wasn't convinced of his own excuse. I looked at them both, feeling the weight of the years of hurt and betrayal. "No, David, it's about family. But you only remember family when it's convenient for you. You didn't want to stick around when I was sick, when I was fighting for my life. You left because I wasn't useful to you anymore, because I was bald, weak, and helpless. You wanted the version of me that cooked your dinners, cleaned your mess, and smiled through my exhaustion." David's face reddened. "That's not fair," he muttered. But I could hear the defensiveness in his voice. "No," I interrupted, my voice steady and calm. "What wasn't fair was being left to die alone while the people I loved the most walked away." Max finally spoke up. His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "We didn't know how to come back, Mom. It was hard." "Hard?" I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. "It was hard for you to see me struggle, wasn't it? But it wasn't hard enough for you to stay. It wasn't hard enough for you to actually care." There it was, the guilt in Max's eyes. I saw it clearly, but I wasn't going to soften. Not anymore. "Not for them." David, still defensive, said, "We made mistakes. I made mistakes, but we want to be part of your life again. We want to fix things." I narrowed my eyes. Funny how that desire only shows up once there's something to gain. Once I'm worth something in your eyes. For a moment, the silence between us grew thick and heavy. I stood firm, my heart pounding, but for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid. I wasn't the woman who would fall apart. I wasn't the woman who would beg them to stay. "I need time to think," I said, my voice firm. I stepped back, ready to close the door. David opened his mouth to protest, but I cut him off. Whatever you're expecting to find here, it won't be what you think." With that, I closed the door, standing there for a long time, my hand resting on the cool wood. My heart was still racing, but I wasn't scared anymore. I had closed the door on them, and for the first time in years, I felt like I had control. After I closed the door on David and Max, I stood there for a long time, my hand resting on the cool wood, still catching my breath. My heart pounded, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was something else, something powerful. For the first time in years, I hadn't crumbled. I hadn't folded into myself, second-guessing my worth. I had stood firm, and that felt like a quiet victory. They hadn't just walked away from me, they had walked away from the woman I had been. But now, they were coming back, because they saw a woman who had rebuilt herself. A woman who had fought for her life and won, and I wasn't going to let them back in without consequences. That night, I sat down with a glass of wine and thought about everything that had happened. I reflected on the people who had helped me through the darkest moments: Eleanor, Alicia, Mrs. Carter, and so many others who showed me what real care and loyalty looked like. They were my family now, not the ones who abandoned me in my time of need. But there was still work to do. I wasn't going to let my past mistakes define me, or leave me vulnerable to being manipulated again. I wasn't going to let David and Max come back into my life just because I had something they wanted. I had learned the hard way that some people only show up when it's convenient for them. So I made some changes. I started updating everything: my will, my estate planning, and even my power of attorney. I wasn't going to leave anything to chance. The people who had shown me real kindness, Eleanor, Alicia, and the local cancer foundation, were the ones who were going to be taken care of. They were the ones who deserved a place in my life. I wasn't being paranoid. I was being prepared. And I knew that the next time David and Max showed up, it wouldn't be to apologize. It would be to take what they thought they could get from me. But this time, I was ready. I wasn't going to make the same mistakes. As I sat there in the quiet of my home, I realized something important. I had come so far. I had fought my way back from the edge, and I was no longer that woman who had depended on others to define her. I was strong, independent, and proud of the woman I had become. And no one, least of all David and Max, was going to take that away from me. The next chapter of my life was mine to write, and I was writing it on my own terms. A couple of days later, a letter arrived. It had no return address, but I immediately recognized the handwriting. It was from David. I couldn't help but roll my eyes before even opening it. I already knew what was inside. A carefully worded letter, filled with sentimental phrases and apologies, written to make me feel guilty for not forgiving them. The usual tactic. But this time, I was ready. I sat down on the couch, the letter in my hands, and I slowly read through it. At first, there were the usual apologies. David claimed he had made mistakes, that he understood he'd hurt me, and that he wanted to make things right. He acknowledged how difficult everything had been, and then, just when I thought it was over, came the final paragraph. "I know things were difficult, but Max is in college now. He's studying finance and we've been living modestly. The tuition is steep, and if there's any way you could help just until he graduates, it would mean the world to us." I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. There it was, the hook. They didn't come back to make amends. They didn't come back because they missed me or because they had any real remorse. They came back for one thing: access. Access to my money. It wasn't about reconciliation. It was about getting what they thought they could from me. I didn't even respond to the letter. Instead, I poured myself a glass of wine, sat by the fireplace, and let the fire crackle as I thought about everything that had happened. I had been living my life, rebuilding it from the ashes of their abandonment, and now they were back, acting like nothing had changed. But I had changed. I wasn't the woman they had left behind. I was someone who knew her worth. That night I called my lawyer. "Isabel," he said, "I was wondering when you'd be in touch." He knew me well enough to understand that this wasn't about forgiveness. This was about protecting myself, protecting the life I had fought so hard to rebuild. I need to update my estate planning, I told him, and I want to make it airtight. We discussed everything: my will, power of attorney, medical directives, and the living trust for the house. I transferred the deed to my property into the trust with specific stipulations. I named my beneficiaries, none of whom included David or Max. Instead, I added Alicia, Eleanor, the local cancer foundation, and some of my neighbors who had become like family to me. I wasn't being bitter, I wasn't trying to punish them, I was just being smart. I had learned that it wasn't about revenge, it was about taking control. It was about making sure that my life, my wealth, and my legacy went to the people who had truly cared about me, not the ones who had only shown up when they thought they could gain something. As I made those changes, I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. The past had been painful, but it had shaped me into the person I was now, a woman who knew her value, who had learned to stand up for herself, and who was no longer afraid to protect what was hers. I knew that David and Max wouldn't give up easily. People like them rarely did, especially when there was money involved. But this time I was ready. I wasn't going to be manipulated again. I wasn't going to be taken advantage of. The next time they showed up, it wouldn't be with apologies. It would be with expectations, but I was done meeting those. The door I had closed on them would stay shut, and the next chapter of my life would be written by me. As I sat in my quiet home, I reflected on everything I had been through: the abandonment, the betrayal, the pain, and the fight for survival. It had all been part of my journey. But the most important lesson I had learned was this: I am enough. I am worthy of love and respect, and I don't need to rely on anyone who can't offer me that. I had spent too many years giving, and getting nothing in return. But now I had learned how to stand up for myself, how to recognize toxic relationships, and how to let go of the people who only cared about what they could get from me. If you're watching this and you've been through something similar, I want you to know that you are not alone. You are strong, and you are capable of moving forward. Don't let anyone tell you that you are disposable or that your worth depends on what you can give. Your true worth is in who you are, not in what others expect from you. If you've learned something from my story, or if you've been in a situation where you had to stand up for yourself, I'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and share this video with anyone